Have you ever judged someone too quickly, only to regret it moments later? That's exactly what happened on this first-class flight from the United States to France. A wealthy businessman, confident and arrogant, turns to the young blonde woman seated nearby and sneers, "People like you don't belong here." The cabin falls silent as his words hang in the air. But here's the twist. This woman isn't just anyone. By the end of the flight, the truth about who she is will leave everyone, especially him, speechless. What did he not see coming? And why will he wish he'd never opened his mouth? Stay tuned. This is a story you won't forget. The hum of the airplane engines filled the cabin as passengers settled into their seats. The first-class section gleamed with luxury, plush leather seats, personalized service, and the promise of a peaceful flight. Among the travelers was Clara Hayes, a 25-year-old blonde woman with a graceful yet understated presence. She wore a simple but elegant dress, her diamond wedding ring catching the light as she adjusted her carry-on beneath the seat. Despite her youthful beauty, Clara kept to herself, her soft smile hinting at a kind and gentle nature. Across the aisle sat Richard Donovan, a 50-year-old construction entrepreneur with a gruff demeanor. He carried himself with the confidence of a self-made man, wearing a tailored suit that spoke of his wealth. But his sharp gaze and furrowed brows revealed something else, an impatience with the world around him. Richard had built his empire brick by brick, and he saw himself as the epitome of success. First class was his domain, and he didn't take kindly to those he believed didn't belong there. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering champagne and warm towels, Richard's eyes lingered on Clara. To him, she didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. Her quiet demeanor, her youthful appearance, it all seemed out of place. He leaned back in his seat, scoffing quietly to himself. When Clara asked the flight attendant for assistance with her seatbelt, Richard couldn't hold back any longer. "First time flying first class," he quipped, his voice dripping with condescension. A few passengers glanced over, sensing the tension. Clara turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "Actually, no," she replied politely, her voice steady. She returned her attention to the attendant, ignoring the man's smirk. But Richard wasn't done. "Must be nice," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. "Some of us work hard to get here." Clara paused, her fingers tightening slightly on her armrest. She chose not to respond, unwilling to escalate the situation. However, the flight attendant shot Richard a warning glance, sensing his growing hostility. Minutes passed, but Richard couldn't seem to let it go. "You know," he said, leaning slightly toward Clara, "not everyone in first class belongs here. Some of us can spot the ones who, well, let's just say, got lucky." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly, but she remained composed. Her silence only seemed to fuel Richard's arrogance. He leaned back in his seat, convinced he had made his point. Unbeknownst to him, other passengers were beginning to take notice. A woman seated 2 rows ahead whispered to her husband, while a businessman diagonally across from Richard frowned in disapproval. Clara, however, maintained her composure, refusing to let the man's words rattle her. As the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin crew began serving lunch. Clara politely declined the wine offered to her, a detail Richard picked up on immediately. "Not drinking." "That explains a lot," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. This time, Clara turned to him, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Is there something you'd like to say directly to me, sir?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. Richard hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her assertiveness. "Just an observation," he said with a shrug, trying to mask his discomfort. "No offense." "None taken," Clara replied, turning her attention back to her meal. Her calm demeanor only seemed to irritate him further. As the meal service continued, Richard struck up a conversation with another passenger, a middle-aged man who appeared to share his background. They exchanged stories of business ventures and success, their voices loud enough to carry through the cabin. Occasionally, Richard would glance at Clara, as if ensuring she could hear every word about his accomplishments. But while Richard basked in his self-importance, Clara remained quiet, focused on a leather-bound notebook she had pulled from her bag. She jotted down a few notes, her elegant pen gliding across the page. The faintest smile tugged at her lips, as if she knew something no one else did. By now, several passengers were aware of the dynamic between the two. Some rolled their eyes at Richard's arrogance, while others silently admired Clara's grace under pressure. The flight attendants, too, had taken notice. One of them, a tall brunette named Samantha, made a point to check on Clara frequently, offering her a warm smile and attentive service. The tension between Clara and Richard simmered beneath the surface, unnoticed by the majority of passengers who were engrossed in their in-flight entertainment. But for those paying attention, it was clear something about this interaction wasn't over. Richard had poked the wrong person, and it was only a matter of time before he realized his mistake. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the beginning of the long-haul journey. Some passengers settled in for a nap, while others tuned into their screens or flipped through glossy magazines. Clara, however, remained focused on her notebook, her pen dancing across the pages with purpose. Richard glanced over occasionally. His curiosity piqued despite himself. What could she possibly be writing? He dismissed the thought with a huff, convincing himself that it was likely nothing important. Still, something about her calm, almost unbothered demeanor irritated him. She wasn't reacting the way he expected. No flustered apologies, no awkward attempts to explain her presence in first class. Instead, she exuded an air of quiet confidence that felt out of place to him. Clara's composure wasn't lost on the other passengers. Samantha, the flight attendant, stopped by Clara's seat once again, her voice warm and friendly. "Can I get you anything else, Mrs. Hayes?" she asked, her tone laced with genuine respect. "Just some water, thank you," Clara replied, her soft smile returning. The use of Mrs. Hayes didn't go unnoticed by Richard. His brow furrowed as he replayed the name in his head. Hayes. Why did that sound familiar? He couldn't quite place it, but something about it tugged at the edges of his memory. Meanwhile, Clara closed her notebook and reached into her carry-on bag, pulling out a sleek laptop. As she opened it, the screen lit up with an impressive array of graphs and spreadsheets. Her fingers moved deftly over the keyboard, her focus unwavering. Richard craned his neck slightly, pretending to adjust his seatbelt in an attempt to get a closer look. What could someone like her possibly be working on? "Curious?" Clara asked suddenly, her eyes meeting his with a knowing glint. Richard straightened up, caught off guard. "No," he replied gruffly, looking away, but his curiosity only grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. Moments later, Samantha returned with Clara's water, along with a folded napkin that she discreetly placed on Clara's tray. Clara unfolded it and smiled to herself before tucking it away. The interaction seemed casual, but Richard noticed the subtle exchange and couldn't help but wonder what it meant. Was the flight attendant going out of her way to accommodate Clara? If so, why? As the hours passed, Richard became increasingly restless. His conversation with the other businessmen had dwindled, leaving him with little distraction from his growing unease. He glanced over at Clara once more, noticing how effortlessly she moved between tasks on her laptop. There was an efficiency to her that didn't align with the image he had painted of her in his mind. Unable to contain himself, he finally broke the silence. "What is it that you do, anyway?" he asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Clara looked up from her laptop, her expression calm but unreadable. "Why do you ask?" she replied, her voice steady. Richard shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Just curious. You don't exactly strike me as the business type." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what type do I strike you as, Mr. Donovan?" she asked, her tone polite but pointed. Richard hesitated, sensing the trap in her question. "Never mind," he muttered, retreating into silence. But Clara wasn't finished. "Since you asked," she began, closing her laptop and placing it neatly on her tray, "I work in strategic partnerships. My husband and I manage several ventures together." "Ah," Richard said with a smirk. "So you're married to the money." A few passengers nearby exchanged glances, their discomfort with Richard's attitude growing. Clara, however, didn't take the bait. "I suppose you could say that," she replied evenly, "though I prefer to think of it as building something meaningful together." Her response only seemed to irritate Richard further. He leaned back in his seat, shaking his head. "Figures," he muttered under his breath. But his smug demeanor faltered when Clara added, "And what about you, Mr. Donovan? What line of work are you in?" "I run a construction company," he said proudly. "Built it from the ground up. Hard work, dedication. That's what gets you places." Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Impressive," she said. her tone genuine. "I admire people who work hard to achieve their goals." The sincerity in her voice caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he felt a flicker of embarrassment for the way he had treated her, but he quickly brushed it aside, unwilling to admit he might have been wrong about her. As the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for the next meal service, Clara turned her attention back to her laptop. Richard, however, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. Who exactly was she? And why did her name, her poise, and her connections seem so familiar? The answer was closer than he realized, and when it came, it would upend everything he thought he knew. As the flight approached the halfway mark, the cabin lights dimmed further to prepare for the evening portion of the journey. A subtle air of calm settled over most passengers, but not for Richard. He found himself fidgeting in his seat, his mind circling back to Clara and the growing mystery surrounding her. After the second meal service, Clara excused herself and walked toward the front of the plane, where the first-class restrooms were located. As she passed Richard, he couldn't help but notice how composed and confident she seemed, a stark contrast to the assumptions he had made about her earlier. He muttered under his breath again, but this time it wasn't clear if he was trying to convince himself of her inferiority or distract himself from his unease. Moments after Clara disappeared, Samantha, the attentive flight attendant, approached Richard's seat with a forced smile. "Mr. Donovan, would you like anything else?" she asked, her tone professional but cool. "No, I'm fine," Richard replied curtly, still distracted. Samantha hesitated for a moment before leaning in slightly. "If I may," she said quietly, "you might want to reconsider how you're speaking to Mrs. Hayes." Richard blinked, taken aback by her directness. "Excuse me," he said, his voice rising slightly. Samantha straightened up, her expression calm but firm. "I just think it's worth pointing out that she's not someone you want to make an enemy of," she said before walking away, leaving Richard to stew in confusion and annoyance. Who was this Clara Hayes, and why was a flight attendant, of all people, warning him about her? Richard's irritation boiled over into curiosity. He reached for his phone, pulling up a notepad where he typically jotted down business ideas. On a whim, he typed in the name Clara Hayes and stared at it for a moment. It still sounded familiar, but he couldn't place why. When Clara returned to her seat, she seemed oblivious to the quiet turmoil brewing in Richard's mind. She resumed her work on her laptop, her fingers moving swiftly across the keyboard. Richard, however, couldn't focus on anything else. He leaned over slightly, feigning interest in the view outside the window, but his eyes darted toward her screen. What he saw made his heart skip a beat. Clara was drafting an email, and at the top of the screen was the logo of Hayes Global Ventures, one of the largest and most influential investment firms in the United States. Richard's pulse quickened. He knew that name. It was impossible not to. Hayes Global Ventures was a powerhouse in the construction industry, known for funding multi-million-dollar projects across the country. In fact, his own company had submitted a proposal to them just a few months ago, hoping to secure a lucrative partnership. The deal could make or break his business. Suddenly, it all clicked. The name Hayes, the deference from the flight attendant, the quiet confidence Clara exuded. It wasn't just an act. This woman wasn't merely someone's wife. She was part of the very company he had been trying to impress. A cold sweat broke out on Richard's forehead as the realization hit him. Clara Hayes wasn't out of place in first class. If anything, she probably belonged there more than he did. For the first time, Richard found himself questioning everything he had said to her. His offhand remarks, his condescending tone. He had treated her like she was beneath him. But now it was clear that she was leagues ahead of him, in both status and influence. And if she remembered his name from the proposal her company had received, he could kiss his chances at a partnership goodbye. Richard's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. Should he apologize? Pretend nothing happened? He glanced at Clara, who seemed completely unfazed by his presence. If she had recognized him, she certainly wasn't showing it. But that didn't mean she hadn't noticed his behavior. As the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting the passengers slightly, Richard's anxiety grew. He suddenly felt very small, like a schoolboy caught misbehaving in front of a teacher. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of being outmatched, not by wealth or power, but by the effortless poise of someone who didn't need to prove themselves. Clara, meanwhile, continued her work, her expression serene, But inside, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. She had recognized Richard Donovan the moment he introduced himself to the other businessmen on the flight. His company's proposal had landed on her desk weeks ago, and while it wasn't particularly remarkable, she hadn't yet decided whether to move forward with it. His behavior on this flight, however, was making that decision much easier. Clara glanced over at Richard briefly, catching his eye. She gave him a polite smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a subtle gesture, but to Richard, it felt like a warning. As the plane continued its journey toward France, the tension between them hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Richard had no idea what Clara would do next, but one thing was certain. He was no longer in control of the situation. The plane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet, but inside Richard's mind, a storm was brewing. He couldn't shake the weight of his realization. The young woman he had dismissed so easily was far from ordinary. Clara Hayes, wife of a renowned entrepreneur and a key player in one of the most powerful investment firms in the country, now had the upper hand, whether she chose to use it or not. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his thoughts spiraling. He replayed every word he had said to her since the flight began, each remark sounding worse in hindsight. The way he'd mocked her, the dismissive tone he'd used, it was all a damning portrait of his arrogance. And now, it could cost him dearly. Clara's, on the other hand, remained composed. She sipped her water and occasionally glanced at her laptop, but her focus had shifted. She was well aware of the turmoil Richard was experiencing. The subtle changes in his demeanor, the tapping of his fingers, the frequent glances in her direction, were all telltale signs of his unease. She had seen men like him before, self-assured to the point of recklessness, their confidence rooted in power rather than substance. But Clara knew something Richard didn't. True power lay in restraint. A flight attendant approached Clara's seat, breaking the silence. "Mrs. Hayes, would you like anything else before we prepare for landing?" Clara smiled warmly. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her tone gracious. The exchange was brief, but it was enough to further unsettle Richard. The respect Clara commanded from the crew was a stark contrast to his earlier treatment of her. Unable to bear the silence any longer, Richard cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hayes," he began hesitantly, his voice softer than before, "I wanted to apologize. I may have come off a bit, blunt earlier." Clara turned to him, her expression neutral. "Blunt?" she echoed, her voice calm but laced with subtle challenge. Richard shifted in his seat, avoiding her gaze. "What I mean is, I might have misjudged you. I didn't mean any harm." Clara studied him for a moment, her blue eyes steady and unflinching. "It's funny, Mr. Donovan," she said finally. "How quick we are to form opinions about others, isn't it?" Richard nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, I suppose it is." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. "Assumptions can be dangerous," she continued, her tone measured. "Sometimes they reveal more about the person making them than the one being judged." Richard swallowed hard. "You're absolutely right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I hope I didn't offend you." Clara tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "Offense is a choice, Mr. Donovan," she replied, "but consequences, those are unavoidable." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Richard felt the weight of them like a physical blow. He tried to gauge whether she was merely making a point or subtly warning him, but her serene expression gave nothing away. As the hours stretched on, Richard grew increasingly desperate to salvage the situation. He considered bringing up the proposal his company had submitted to Hayes Global Ventures, but the thought made him cringe. How could he ask for her consideration now, after everything he had said? The irony wasn't lost on him. The very person he had insulted held the key to his company's future. Clara, meanwhile, maintained her composure. She wasn't one to lash out or seek immediate revenge. Instead, she let Richard stew in his discomfort, knowing it was a far more effective lesson than any direct confrontation. She didn't need to remind him of her power. He was already painfully aware. As the flight neared its destination, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to Charles de Gaulle Airport. The cabin buzzed with quiet activity as passengers began preparing for landing. Richard glanced at Clara one last time, his mind racing with questions. Would she tell her husband about his behavior? Would she remember his name when reviewing the proposal, or had he already sealed his fate? Clara leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window as the lights of Paris came into view. She could feel Richard's eyes on her, but she didn't acknowledge him. She had already made up her mind about how to handle the situation, but she saw no need to reveal her decision just yet. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Richard felt a sinking sensation in his chest. He had entered this flight as a confident, self-assured businessman, but he was leaving it humbled and uncertain. The woman he had underestimated had turned out to be far more formidable than he could have imagined. Clara gathered her belongings, her movements graceful and unhurried. As she prepared to disembark, she glanced at Richard one final time. "Safe travels, Mr. Donovan," she said, her voice smooth and polite, but there was something in her tone, an edge of finality, that sent a chill down his spine. As the plane reached its gate at Charles de Gaulle Airport, the passengers began gathering their belongings, eager to disembark. Richard felt a gnawing sense of dread as he stood up and retrieved his carry-on from the overhead compartment. The realization that Clara Hayes was not just another passenger, but someone with the power to influence his future still loomed over him like a storm cloud. Clara, on the other hand, seemed entirely at ease. She placed her leather notebook into her bag, checked her phone for messages, and adjusted her coat with the calm precision of someone who had nothing to prove. Her demeanor only heightened Richard's anxiety. He felt like he was watching a chess master several moves ahead, while he was still fumbling to understand the game. As they filed off the plane, Clara disappeared into the crowd of passengers heading toward customs. Richard, unable to shake his unease, kept his distance but found himself scanning the bustling terminal for her blonde hair and elegant stride. To his surprise, he spotted her not in the line for customs, but speaking with an airport official in a sharply tailored uniform. The official, a woman in her 40s with an air of authority, greeted Clara warmly, as if she were a frequent traveler or someone of importance. Clara handed over her passport and exchanged a few words before being escorted through a separate VIP line, bypassing the usual wait times. Richard watched in stunned silence, his mind racing. Who exactly was Clara Hayes? How deep did her connections go? The more he learned about her, the more he realized how profoundly he had miscalculated. Once through customs, Richard began heading toward the baggage claim. He told himself to focus on his own itinerary. He had a meeting with a potential investor in Paris and couldn't afford to be distracted. But as fate would have it, the next complication was waiting for him just a few steps away. Standing near the carousel was a man Richard immediately recognized, James Hayes, the CEO of Hayes Global Ventures and Clara's husband. James was tall and charismatic, with a commanding presence that matched his reputation. He wore a tailored suit and an easy smile, the kind of man who seemed at home in any situation. Beside him stood Clara, her expression softening as she greeted her husband with a kiss on the cheek. Richard froze, his heart pounding. Of all the places to run into the CEO of Hayes Global Ventures, the baggage claim of Charles de Gaulle was the last he expected. He quickly ducked behind a pillar, his mind racing. Should he approach James and try to make amends, or would that only make matters worse? As Richard debated his next move, Clara glanced in his direction. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Richard felt his stomach drop. Did she recognize him? Did she tell her husband about his behavior on the flight? Clara's gaze lingered for a second before she turned back to James, who was now speaking to a chauffeur holding a sign with their name on it. Richard decided to stay put, hoping to avoid an awkward confrontation. He watched as Clara and James were escorted out of the terminal by their driver, disappearing into the bustling Parisian streets. Only when they were out of sight did Richard breathe a sigh of relief, though the tension in his chest remained. But his reprieve was short-lived. As he retrieved his suitcase and headed toward his own taxi, his phone buzzed with an email notification. Pulling it out, Richard's blood ran cold when he saw the sender, Hayes Global Ventures. The subject line read, "Meeting request. Follow-up discussion." For a moment, Richard considered ignoring the email, but he knew that wasn't an option. With trembling hands, he opened it and read the contents. The message was brief and professional, inviting him to a meeting at the Hayes Global Ventures office in Paris the following morning. Attached was an agenda outlining a review of his company's proposal, along with potential terms for partnership. Richard's initial relief at being granted the meeting was quickly overshadowed by panic. The timing was no coincidence. Clara must have orchestrated this. But why? Was she giving him a chance to redeem himself, or was this her way of ensuring he faced the consequences of his actions? Either way, he couldn't afford to decline. As he climbed into a taxi and gave the driver the address of his hotel, Richard's mind churned with possibilities. The proposal had been his company's most ambitious to date, a project that could elevate his business to new heights. But now, it felt like a double-edged sword. If Clara chose to hold his behavior against him, the entire deal could crumble. That night, Richard barely slept. He paced his hotel room, rehearsing what he would say during the meeting. Should he address the incident on the flight directly, or wait for Clara to bring it up? Should he apologize again, or would that only make him seem weak? Every scenario he imagined ended in disaster. By the time morning came, Richard was a bundle of nerves. He arrived at the Hayes Global Ventures office early, dressed in his sharpest suit but feeling anything but confident. The sleek glass building loomed above him, a symbol of the power and influence he had so carelessly underestimated. As he stepped into the lobby, he was greeted by a receptionist who directed him to a conference room on the top floor. Richard's palms were sweaty as he rode the elevator, each ding of the passing floors heightening his anticipation. When the doors opened, he was met with a stunning view of Paris and a long conference table at the center of the room. Sitting at the head of the table was Clara, her expression calm and composed. Beside her was James, who greeted Richard with a firm handshake and a polite smile. Clara, however, said nothing, her gaze steady as she gestured for him to take a seat. Richard's heart pounded as he sat down, knowing that the next few moments could determine the future of his company and his reputation. The conference room was a picture of modern sophistication, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the Paris skyline, sleek leather chairs encircling a polished glass table, and a faint hum of air conditioning that barely broke the silence. Richard sat stiffly in one of the chairs, his hands clasped tightly on the table to hide their slight tremble. Clara sat across from him, her expression unreadable. Beside her, James Hayes exuded the effortless confidence of a man who controlled empires. His warm, polite demeanor only heightened Richard's discomfort. How could someone who seemed so approachable hold so much power? "Mr. Donovan," James began, his voice smooth and professional, "thank you for taking the time to meet with us on such short notice. Clara mentioned your proposal, and we wanted to give it a closer look while we're here in Paris." Richard forced a smile, his throat dry. "Of course. I'm honored to have the opportunity." Clara remained silent, her gaze fixed on him like a spotlight. Richard felt as though every word he spoke was being carefully weighed and measured. The memory of his behavior on the flight loomed over him, an invisible barrier between him and the opportunity he desperately needed. James continued, flipping through a printed copy of the proposal. "Your company has an impressive track record, and we appreciate the innovative approach you've outlined here. However," he paused, glancing at Clara, "there are a few concerns we'd like to address." Richard's stomach sank. He had expected scrutiny, but the weight of this moment felt almost unbearable. "I'd be happy to clarify any concerns," he said quickly, his voice wavering slightly. James nodded. "Good. Clara, would you like to start?" Clara leaned forward, placing her hands neatly on the table. Her movements were deliberate, her tone calm but firm. "Mr. Donovan," she began, "your proposal outlines ambitious timelines and cost estimates, but there are gaps in the risk analysis. For example, your projections don't account for potential delays in material procurement, which is a significant issue in today's market. Can you elaborate on how you plan to mitigate those risks?" Richard swallowed hard, his mind scrambling to recall the details of the proposal. He had prepared extensively, but under Clara's sharp gaze, his confidence faltered. "Fouati, we have contingency plans in place to address supply chain disruptions," he stammered. "Our partnerships with multiple suppliers ensure that we can adapt to unforeseen delays." Clara raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Multiple suppliers can reduce risk, but without specific agreements in place, it's not a guarantee. Have you secured any binding contracts with these suppliers?" Richard hesitated, his heart sinking further. "Not yet, but we're in the final stages of negotiation. I see, Clara said, her voice cool. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. Mr. Donovan, in our industry, preparation and foresight are everything. Clients need to trust that their partners have considered every possibility, especially when large investments are at stake. James, sensing the tension, intervened with a smile. To be fair, Clara, these are challenges most companies face. I think the question is whether Mr. Donovan's team is willing to adapt and refine their approach to meet our standards. Richard nodded eagerly. Absolutely. We are fully committed to addressing any concerns and ensuring that our approach aligns with your expectations. Clara's expression softened slightly, but there was still an edge to her demeanor. Good to hear, she said. However, there's another matter I'd like to discuss. Richard's pulse quickened. Here it was, the moment he had been dreading. Clara clasped her hands together, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Donovan, I couldn't help but notice your behavior during the flight yesterday. It's not often that I encounter someone who makes such strong assumptions about others without taking the time to know them. The room fell silent. Richard felt the heat rise to his face, his carefully rehearsed responses evaporating in an instant. He glanced at James, who looked mildly curious but not alarmed. It was clear that Clara hadn't shared every detail of their interaction, at least not yet. I wasn't at my best, Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I deeply regret how I acted, and I hope you'll accept my sincerest apology. Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening. Apologies are a start, Mr. Donovan, she said, but actions speak louder than words. The way we treat others reflects our character, both personally and professionally. Richard nodded, feeling both humbled and exposed. You're absolutely right, he said. I made a mistake, and I can assure you it won't happen again. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she exchanged a glance with James, who gave her an encouraging nod. After a brief pause, she said, Let's focus on the proposal for now. But I hope this serves as a reminder of the importance of respect and humility, no matter the circumstances. James smiled, breaking the tension. Well said, Clara. Now, Mr. Donovan, let's talk about next steps. As the discussion shifted back to business, Richard felt a flicker of hope. Clara had given him a chance, not a guarantee, but an opportunity to prove himself, and he knew that from this moment on, he couldn't afford to take it for granted. As the meeting progressed, Richard felt a faint glimmer of relief. The discussion had returned to the proposal, and James seemed receptive to his ideas, offering constructive feedback rather than outright rejection. Clara, however, remained an enigmatic presence. Her sharp questions and pointed observations kept Richard on edge, but there was no sign of overt hostility, only a quiet intensity that suggested she was carefully evaluating every word he said. The tension in the room was palpable, but Richard began to think he might survive this ordeal unscathed. That is, until Clara casually leaned back in her chair and dropped a seemingly innocent question. Mr. Donovan, she said, her tone light but deliberate, I noticed you mentioned in your proposal that you're planning to source materials from Larson Supply Company. Isn't that the same company currently facing legal trouble over unsafe practices? Richard froze, his blood turning cold. Larson Supply was indeed under scrutiny for a recent scandal involving substandard materials, but he hadn't expected Clara to bring it up. The detail was buried deep in the industry news, and most people wouldn't have caught it. Clearly, Clara wasn't most people. Well, Richard began, scrambling for a response. Larson Supply has assured us that they're addressing those issues. We've been in close communication with their team, and we're confident in their ability to meet our standards. Clara tilted her head, her expression unreadable. I see. So you're willing to take that risk? It's not a risk, Richard said quickly, his voice faltering. We've done our due diligence. Clara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she exchanged a glance with James, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Richard felt the weight of their scrutiny bearing down on him. Due diligence is critical, Clara said finally. But so is perception. If word gets out that one of our partners is working with a company under investigation, it could reflect poorly on all of us. Reputation is everything in this industry. Wouldn't you agree? Of course, Richard said, nodding vigorously. I completely understand. We're already exploring alternative suppliers to ensure there are no issues. Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't one of reassurance. Good. I'm glad to hear that. The discussion moved on, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was testing him. Her questions were calculated, her tone deceptively calm. It was as though she was peeling back the layers of his proposal, searching for weaknesses, not just in his business plan, but in him as a person. As the meeting drew to a close, James leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Well, Mr. Donovan, I think we've covered everything we needed to today. Your proposal shows promise, but there's room for improvement. We'll need to see some revisions before moving forward. Of course, Richard said, forcing a smile. I'll make the necessary adjustments right away. James nodded. Excellent. Clara and I will be in Paris for a few more days. Let's plan to reconvene at the end of the week to review the updated proposal. Richard's heart sank. He had hoped to leave the meeting with a clear answer, but instead, he was being given another chance to prove himself, another opportunity for Clara to scrutinize his every move. Still, he couldn't afford to let his disappointment show. Thank you, he said, rising to shake James's hand. I appreciate the opportunity. As James escorted Richard to the door, Clara remained seated, her expression unreadable. But just as Richard reached the threshold, she spoke again. Oh, Mr. Donovan, she said, her voice casual but laced with something sharper. One last thing. You might want to double-check the figures in your financial projections. I noticed a discrepancy on page 15 of your proposal. Richard turned, his face flushing. A discrepancy? He echoed, his voice faltering. Clara nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, it's small, but it could raise questions if left unaddressed. I'm sure you'll catch it. The room seemed to close in around Richard as he nodded mutely. Of course, I'll look into it. With that, Clara turned her attention back to her laptop, effectively dismissing him. James gave Richard a polite smile and a firm handshake before closing the door behind him. As Richard walked down the hallway, his mind raced. The discrepancy Clara mentioned wasn't something he had noticed before, but if it was significant enough for her to call it out, it could jeopardize the entire proposal. And the fact that she had waited until the very end to mention it felt deliberate, as though she wanted to leave him with a final reminder of who held the upper hand. By the time Richard stepped out into the Parisian streets, he felt completely unmoored. The meeting hadn't been a disaster, but it hadn't been a success either. Clara had left him with more questions than answers, and the weight of her scrutiny lingered like a shadow over his thoughts. As he hailed a taxi back to his hotel, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, not in the literal sense, but in a way that made him hyper-aware of every decision he made. Clara Hayes had become more than just a potential partner. She was a force to be reckoned with, and whether she chose to help him or destroy him was entirely up to her. The taxi ride back to his hotel was a blur for Richard. Paris's vibrant streets, filled with bustling cafes and historic architecture, passed unnoticed as he replayed the meeting over and over in his mind. Every word Clara had spoken felt like a carefully placed dagger, subtle yet devastating. She wasn't just testing his business acumen, she was testing him as a person. Once in his room, Richard dropped his bag onto the bed and immediately opened his laptop. He needed to find the discrepancy Clara had mentioned. Page 15. Financial projections. His fingers trembled slightly as he scrolled through the proposal. When he reached the section in question, his heart sank. There it was, an error in the projected revenue streams for the second quarter. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was noticeable, enough to make him look careless. Richard cursed under his breath. How could he have missed this? Worse, how had Clara noticed it so quickly? The thought of her sharp gaze scanning every line of his proposal sent a chill down his spine. She wasn't just thorough, she was relentless. Determined to salvage the situation, Richard spent the rest of the evening revising the proposal. He double-checked every figure, every chart, ensuring there were no other mistakes. But as the hours dragged on, a deeper worry began to gnaw at him. Even if he fixed the proposal, would it be enough to win Clara's approval? Or had his behavior on the flight already sealed his fate? The next morning, Richard received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway, hoping it might be a follow-up from James or Clara. Instead, a smooth, authoritative voice greeted him. "Mr. Donovan, this is Edward Marchand. I'm calling on behalf of Hayes Global Ventures." Richard's pulse quickened. Edward Marchand was a senior executive at Hayes Global, one of James's most trusted advisors. The fact that he was reaching out directly could mean one of two things. Either the deal was progressing or it was about to fall apart. "Mr. Marchand, thank you for calling," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady. "How can I help you?" "I've been asked to review your revised proposal," Edward replied. "Clara mentioned some concerns during yesterday's meeting, and I'd like to ensure those are addressed before we proceed." Richard's stomach churned, so Clara had been talking about him. "Of course," he said. "I've been working on the revisions and can have them ready for review by the end of the day." "Excellent," Edward said. "In the meantime, I'd advise you to familiarize yourself with Clara's work. She has a unique perspective that could be valuable to your approach." Richard frowned, unsure of how to interpret the comment. "I'll do that," he said, though he wasn't sure what Edward meant. Was this a subtle warning, or was he being encouraged to align his strategy more closely with Clara's vision? After the call ended, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was at the center of everything. Her influence extended far beyond the meeting room, and it was clear that she held significant sway within Hayes Global Ventures. If he wanted to succeed, he needed to understand her better, not just as a businesswoman, but as a person. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, Richard began researching Clara Hayes. He found articles detailing her rise within the company, her reputation for precision and innovation, and her involvement in several high-profile projects. But what struck him most was her philanthropic work. Clara had spearheaded initiatives to support small businesses, particularly those in struggling communities. She wasn't just a strategist, she was a visionary with a deep sense of purpose. The more Richard learned, the more his perception of Clara shifted. She wasn't just a powerful figure in the business world, she was someone who demanded excellence because she held herself to the same standard. And suddenly, Richard saw the meeting in a new light. Clara's scrutiny hadn't been an attack, it had been a test. She wanted to see if he was capable of rising to the challenge. That realization brought a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, it meant he still had a chance to prove himself. On the other, it meant the stakes were higher than ever. Clara wouldn't settle for mediocrity, and if he failed to meet her expectations, it wouldn't just be his business that suffered, it would be his pride. Determined to turn things around, Richard decided to take Edward's advice. He revised his proposal again, this time incorporating elements inspired by Clara's past projects. He focused on sustainability, community impact, and long-term value, areas he knew would resonate with her vision. It was a risk, but it was one he had to take. By the time the revised proposal was ready, Richard felt a renewed sense of determination. He still didn't know how Clara truly felt about him or whether she had already made up her mind. But for the first time since the flight, he felt like he was on the right path. The real test would come at their next meeting. And as Richard prepared to face Clara and James once again, he couldn't shake the feeling that his future depended not just on his business acumen, but on his ability to rise above his own flaws and earn their trust. The day of the follow-up meeting arrived, and Richard found himself standing once again in the sleek lobby of Hayes Global Ventures' Paris office. He had spent the last 2 days refining his proposal to perfection, ensuring every detail aligned with Clara's expectations. Yet, despite his preparation, a knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach. This meeting wasn't just about business, it was about redemption. As the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Richard was greeted by Edward Marchand. The senior executive extended a firm handshake, his expression polite but unreadable. "Mr. Donovan, good to see you again," Edward said. "James and Clara are waiting for you in the conference room." Richard nodded, his palms slightly damp. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Edward led him down a glass-walled corridor that overlooked the Paris skyline. The air was thick with tension as they approached the conference room. Inside, James sat at the head of the table, reviewing a document with his usual calm demeanor. Clara, however, was the picture of quiet authority. Her sharp blue eyes met Richard's as he entered, and he felt the weight of her scrutiny immediately. "Mr. Donovan," James said, rising to shake his hand. I trust you've made the necessary revisions to your proposal. I have, Richard replied, handing over a sleek binder and a flash drive containing the updated presentation. I've addressed all the points raised in our last meeting and incorporated additional elements that align with your company's values. James took the binder with a nod, while Clara leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving Richard. Let's see what you've got, she said, her tone neutral but laced with curiosity. Richard launched into his presentation, carefully outlining the changes he had made. He highlighted new sustainability measures, community impact initiatives, and contingency plans for supply chain risks. He spoke with a confidence that surprised even himself, his voice steady and his arguments clear. This was his moment to prove that he wasn't just another arrogant businessman, that he could rise to the standards Clara and James demanded. As he concluded, Richard looked directly at Clara, his expression earnest. I've taken your feedback to heart, Mrs. Hayes. Your insights have helped me see areas where we can improve, and I'm confident this revised proposal addresses your concerns. Clara didn't respond immediately. She flipped through the binder, her eyes scanning the pages with meticulous care. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, and Richard felt as though the entire world hinged on her reaction. Finally, Clara looked up. It's a marked improvement, she said, her tone measured. I've addressed the key gaps we identified, and I appreciate the effort you've put into incorporating our values. Relief washed over Richard, but it was short-lived. Clara's gaze sharpened as she added, However, there's one more issue we need to discuss. Richard's heart sank. So, of course, he said, forcing himself to stay calm. What is it? Clara leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. Your partnership with Larson Supply, she said. I noticed you've included an alternative supplier in your revisions, but there's no indication that you've severed ties with Larson entirely. Richard swallowed hard. He had anticipated this question, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. We're in the process of finalizing an agreement with the alternative supplier, he said carefully, but transitioning away from Larson will take time. Clara's expression remained neutral, but there was an unmistakable edge to her voice as she replied, Time is a luxury we don't always have, Mr. Donovan. Larson's reputation is a liability, and associating with them could jeopardize not only your company's image, but ours as well. James interjected, his tone more conciliatory. Clara's right, Richard. It's a critical point, but we also understand the challenges of making a transition like this. What we need to see from you is a clear plan for cutting ties with Larson and securing a reliable alternative. I understand, Richard said, nodding earnestly. I'll prioritize this issue and provide you with a detailed plan by the end of the week. Clara studied him for a moment, her expression softening slightly. Good, she said, because in this business, trust is everything. And trust is built on the decisions we make, both big and small. Her words hung in the air, and Richard felt their weight deeply. This wasn't just about fixing a proposal or landing a deal. It was about proving himself worthy of their trust. For the first time, he realized that his success or failure hinged not just on his business acumen, but on his ability to rise above his own shortcomings and make the right choices. The meeting concluded on a cautiously optimistic note. James thanked Richard for his efforts and assured him that they would review his proposal further before making a final decision. Clara, however, remained reserved. As she walked him to the door, she paused and turned to him. Mr. Donovan, she said, her voice quiet but firm, I've seen many people in your position, and I've learned that actions speak louder than words. If you want to earn our partnership, show us what you're capable of. Don't just tell us. Richard nodded, her words resonating deeply. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I won't let you down. As he left the building, Richard felt a mix of hope and determination. The meeting had been a turning point, not just for the deal, but for his understanding of himself. He had been given a chance, and he knew he couldn't afford to waste it. The following days were a whirlwind for Richard. He threw himself into the process of severing ties with Larson Supply, negotiating with their replacement, and crafting a detailed plan to present to Hayes Global Ventures. Each decision felt like a precarious balancing act, with his company's future and his reputation hanging in the balance. He worked late into the night, driven not just by fear of failure, but by a newfound determination to prove himself worthy of the opportunity Clara and James had given him. By the time the final meeting arrived, Richard felt both exhausted and strangely resolute. He had done everything in his power to address the concerns Clara had raised. Now, it was time to face her once more and see if his efforts would be enough. The meeting was held in the same conference room as before, but the atmosphere felt different this time. Clara and James were already seated when Richard entered, their expressions unreadable. Edward Marchand was also present, seated at the far end of the table with a laptop in front of him. The tension in the room was palpable as Richard took his seat. "Mr. Donovan," James began, his tone polite but formal, "thank you for joining us again. We've reviewed the revisions you've submitted, and we're eager to hear how you've addressed the remaining issues." Richard nodded, his hands steady as he opened his binder and began his presentation. He outlined his plan for transitioning away from Larsen Supply, detailing the steps he had already taken and the timeline for completing the process. He provided assurances about the new supplier's reliability, supported by binding agreements he had secured. Every point was backed by data, and his delivery was confident and concise. As he spoke, Richard stole occasional glances at Clara. Her expression remained calm and focused, her blue eyes fixed on him with an intensity that was both unnerving and motivating. He couldn't tell whether she was impressed or simply waiting for him to falter. When he finished, the room fell silent. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. Edward typed something on his laptop, his expression neutral. But it was Clara who broke the silence. "You've done well," she said, her tone measured. "The steps you've outlined are thorough, and your commitment to addressing our concerns is evident. However," she paused, letting the word linger in the air, "there's one last thing I need to understand." Richard's heart sank. He had been expecting this, but the weight of her words still hit him like a blow. Clara leaned forward slightly, her gaze piercing. "You've shown that you can adapt under pressure, which is commendable. But adaptability isn't enough. What I want to know, Mr. Donovan, is this what drives you? Why should we trust you to uphold the values that Hayes Global Ventures stands for?" The question caught Richard off guard. He had prepared for every possible critique of his proposal, but this was something deeper, something personal. He hesitated, searching for the right words. He began, his voice faltering. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet Clara's gaze. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "on the flight, in my assumptions, and in the way I've conducted myself at times. But those mistakes have taught me something important. Success isn't just about ambition or results. It's about integrity, about earning trust, and respecting the people you work with." Clara's expression remained unreadable, but she didn't interrupt. "I used to think that as long as I delivered results, nothing else mattered," Richard continued. "But this experience has shown me that the how is just as important as the what. I'm not just here to win a deal. I'm here to build something meaningful, something I can be proud of. And if you give me this opportunity, I'll do everything in my power to prove that I'm worthy of your trust." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Richard's words hanging in the air. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't anticipated. But he also felt a sense of clarity, as though he had finally understood what Clara had been trying to teach him all along. James nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Well said, Richard," he said. "Integrity is a cornerstone of our work, and it's something we value deeply in our partners." Clara remained silent for a moment longer before finally speaking. "Actions speak louder than words," she said, her tone softer than before. "But I believe you've taken the first step toward earning our trust. Let's see if you can follow through." The tension in the room eased slightly, and Richard felt a surge of relief. He knew he still had work to do, but for the first time he felt like he had a real chance to succeed. As the meeting concluded, Clara approached Richard as he gathered his belongings. "Mr. Donovan," she said quietly, "you've shown potential. Don't waste it." Richard nodded, her words resonating deeply. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, I won't." As he left the building, the weight on Richard's shoulders felt lighter. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it with a renewed sense of purpose. Clara had given him a chance, not because she had to, but because she believed in his potential, and he was determined not to let her down. The days following the final meeting were some of the longest in Richard's life. While James and Clara deliberated on his proposal, Richard was left to grapple with a mix of hope and uncertainty. Every email notification, every phone call made his heart race, only to end in disappointment when it wasn't the decision he was waiting for. Back in his office, his team was growing restless. They knew how critical this deal was for the company's future, and Richard's unusually quiet demeanor only added to their anxiety. His assistant, Karen, knocked gently on his office door one afternoon, holding a folder in her hand. "Anything yet?" she asked, her tone cautious. Richard shook his head. "Not yet," he said, rubbing his temples. "But they said we'd hear back by the end of the week." Karen hesitated, then placed the folder on his desk. "You've done everything you can, Richard. If they don't accept, it's not because you didn't try." Her words were meant to reassure him, but they only deepened his resolve. This wasn't just about the proposal anymore. It was about proving to Clara that he was more than the man she had met on that flight. By Friday afternoon, Richard was on edge. He had gone over every detail of his proposal, every interaction with Clara and James, searching for clues about how they might decide. His phone sat on his desk, silent and foreboding. The longer the wait dragged on, the more his confidence wavered. Finally, just as the clock ticked past 5 p.m., his phone buzzed. Richard snatched it up, his heart pounding as he saw the name on the screen, Clara Hayes. He took a deep breath and answered, forcing his voice to stay steady. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. "Thank you for calling." "Good evening, Mr. Donovan," Clara replied, her tone calm but businesslike. "I wanted to inform you that James and I have reviewed your proposal and discussed it with our team." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. He could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that followed. "We've decided to move forward with your company," Clara continued. "Your revisions addressed our concerns, and we believe this partnership has the potential to be mutually beneficial." Relief and disbelief flooded Richard all at once. "Thank you," he said, his voice almost cracking. "I can't tell you how much this means to me and my team. I promise you won't regret this decision." "I hope not," Clara said, her tone softening slightly. "But remember, Mr. Donovan, this is just the beginning. We'll be watching closely to ensure you deliver on your promises." "Of course," Richard said quickly. "You have my word." Clara paused for a moment before adding, "One more thing, I didn't tell James about our interaction on the flight. I thought it was more important for you to learn from it than to be judged by it." Richard was stunned into silence. The realization that Clara had chosen to keep their encounter private left him both grateful and humbled. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I won't forget that." "I trust you won't," Clara replied. "Good luck, Mr. Donovan. We'll be in touch." As the call ended, Richard set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, exhaling a deep breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The deal was done. He had secured the partnership that could transform his company's future, but more importantly, he had earned Clara's respect, something far more valuable than he had initially understood. Later that evening, as Richard reflected on the journey that had brought him here, he couldn't help but think about Clara's words. Actions speak louder than words. The man he had been on that flight, the arrogant, dismissive businessman, was a far cry from the man he was now. Clara hadn't just challenged him to improve his proposal, she had challenged him to become better. Weeks passed, and the partnership between Richard's company and Hayes Global Ventures began to take shape. The initial stages were demanding: conference calls, site visits, and rigorous oversight from Clara and her team. Every interaction with her was a subtle reminder of the high standards she expected, but Richard embraced the challenge. For the first time in his career, he felt like he was working not just for success, but for something greater. One afternoon, Clara surprised Richard with a visit to one of his project sites. She arrived unannounced, her presence catching both Richard and his team off guard. Dressed in a tailored blazer and practical flats, Clara walked through the site with a clipboard in hand, taking notes and asking pointed questions. "This is where the foundation will be laid," she asked, gesturing to a cleared area of land. "Yes," Richard replied, walking alongside her. "We've made adjustments based on the feedback from your engineering team. The materials are already being shipped from the new supplier." Clara nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Good. And what about the timeline? Are you still on track to meet the milestones we discussed?" "We are," Richard said confidently. "In fact, we're slightly ahead of schedule." Clara stopped and turned to him, her blue eyes piercing, slightly ahead of schedule. That's not something I hear often. Richard allowed himself a small smile. I've learned to prioritize preparation and foresight, he said. Thanks to your feedback, I've implemented changes across the board. It's made a world of difference. Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. Impressive, she said. But remember, it's not just about meeting deadlines. It's about maintaining quality and trust every step of the way. Understood, Richard said. I won't let you down. As they continued their tour, Clara's demeanor softened slightly. She asked about Richard's team, his vision for the project, and even his long-term goals for the company. It was the first time Richard felt like she was seeing him not just as a business partner, but as someone capable of growth and leadership. When the tour ended, Clara turned to Richard with a faint smile. You've come a long way since that flight, she said. I wasn't sure if you'd rise to the challenge, but you've proven me wrong. Richard felt a surge of gratitude and pride. Thank you, Mrs. Hayes, he said. I owe a lot of that to you. Clara's smile widened slightly. Just remember what I said. Actions speak louder than words. Keep proving yourself, and you'll go far. As Clara left the site, Richard stood in the afternoon sun, watching her car disappear down the road. For the first time, he felt like he truly understood what it meant to lead. Not through arrogance or force, but through humility, respect, and unwavering dedication. Back in her office, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought Richard to this point. She had seen countless business people over the years, some ambitious, others arrogant, but few had shown the capacity for transformation that Richard had. He had taken her feedback to heart, faced his flaws head-on, and emerged stronger for it. James entered the office, a cup of coffee in hand. How was the site visit? He asked, sitting down across from her. Surprisingly good, Clara replied. Richard's made significant progress. I think he's starting to understand what it takes to succeed, not just in business, Matt, but as a leader. James smiled. You have a knack for pushing people to be their best. It's one of the things I admire most about you. Clara glanced out the window, her expression contemplative. Sometimes people just need a chance to prove themselves, she said, even if it means challenging them to their core. For Richard, the partnership with Hayes Global Ventures became more than just a professional milestone. It became a turning point in his life. The lessons he had learned from Clara reshaped not only how he approached business, but how he saw himself. He began mentoring his own team, sharing the principles of integrity and humility that Clara had instilled in him. The change didn't go unnoticed. His company flourished, earning a reputation for reliability and excellence. Months later, Richard found himself on another flight, this time to meet a new client overseas. As he settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but think back to that fateful flight where it all began. The man he had been then felt like a distant memory, someone he barely recognized. When the flight attendant offered him a glass of champagne, Richard smiled and shook his head. Just water, thank you. As the plane took off, Richard pulled out a notebook and began jotting down ideas for his next project. The lessons Clara had taught him echoed in his mind, shaping every decision he made. He knew he still had much to learn, but for the first time, he felt truly prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And somewhere miles away, Clara Hayes smiled to herself, knowing that she had made a difference not just in a business deal, but in the life of a man who had finally learned what it meant to lead with purpose. The transformation Richard experienced was not just a professional evolution. It was deeply personal. He had started the journey as a man driven by ego and blinded by assumptions. But through Clara's unyielding expectations and her subtle yet impactful guidance, he had become a leader who valued integrity, respect, and growth above all else. His success with Hayes Global Ventures wasn't just a win for his company. It was a testament to his ability to rise above his past mistakes. Months after securing the partnership, Richard's company thrived. The project with Hayes Global Ventures became a hallmark of innovation and efficiency, earning accolades from industry peers and setting a new standard for excellence. But the real victory lay in the lessons Richard carried forward, lessons that reshaped his leadership style and strengthened his relationships with his team. One evening, as Richard prepared to leave the office, Karen, his assistant, knocked on the door. "You've got a package," she said. setting a sleek black box on his desk. Curious, Richard opened it to find a leather-bound journal embossed with his initials. Inside was a note written in Clara's elegant handwriting. Mr. Donovan, actions speak louder than words, but reflection sharpens action. Keep learning, keep leading, and never stop striving for excellence. Best wishes, Clara Hayes. Richard smiled, running his fingers over the journal's smooth cover. Clara's words resonated deeply, reminding him of how far he had come. He placed the journal on his desk, a symbol of the journey that had brought him to this point, and a reminder of the road ahead. As the camera fades to black, the narrator's voice returns, reflecting on the broader themes of the story. Life often places us in situations where our character is tested, where our assumptions are challenged, and where we're given a chance to grow, if we're willing to take it. Richard Donovan's journey is a reminder that arrogance can blind us, but humility and hard work can lead to transformation. And Clara Hayes, she showed us the power of leadership rooted in integrity and the ability to inspire change in others. Her influence wasn't just in her business acumen, but in her capacity to see potential in people and challenge them to rise to it. If this story inspired you, imagine what more you can achieve when you challenge your own assumptions and embrace growth. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had an experience that changed the way you see yourself or others? Let us know below. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories like this, filled with lessons, twists, and powerful transformations. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next video. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching. And as always, remember, every story has a lesson, and every lesson has the power to change your life.